During our 3 days of conference, and irrespectively of the topic, country, and region we covered, there was hardly any event that has not specifically mentioned the role of China. The more we are excited to speak in this event about the relationship status between China and the EU and explore the complexity of it. On the one hand, the strong trading exposure between China and the US and the EU is of most systemic importance. At the same time, however, high-level EU officials recently referred to China as a systematic rival and called for more aggressive political and economic sanctions. On top of that, increasing tensions between the US and China over the last years generate sort of a political lawfare triangle, which creates additional complexity for the EU strategy on China. Given these and many other aspects, we are extremely excited to dive deeper into this complicated relationship with our two distinct and highly experienced experts. It's an incredible pleasure to have Julia Friedlander and Achim Wambach with us. Julia Friedlander is a senior fellow and deputy director of the GeoEconomics Center at the Atlantic Council. From 2017 and 2019, Julia was an advisor to the White House as the director for the European Union and Economic Affairs at the National Security Council. She is also a young leader of the Munich Security Conference. Her expertise covers all aspects of security, economic relations, trade, and economic sanctions. Our second speaker is Achim Wambach. Achim Wambach is a leading economic advisor to the German government. He's the president of ChinaEU, the Leibniz-Centre for European Economic Research, one of the leading research institutions in Europe. He's the board member of the German Monopoly Commissions, which he led as a chairman from 2014 to 2020. He's a professor of economics at the University of Mannheim. We will start with introductory statements by each of our experts. Hereafter, our experts will discuss on what should or shouldn't be done from their European or American perspective. We will then conclude with a Q&A. Please, therefore, feel free to use our chat throughout this event. Now, let me please hand over to Achim Wambach.
Yes, hello, good evening from Germany. Razi, thank you very much for this kind introduction. I would like to share some slides with you, and I have a few words on how Germany and Europe is positioning itself toward China. So let me maybe directly delve into the topic. So just two slides with data on it. Look at the data. That's European data. Our trade with China is increasing over time. It's incredibly increasing. That's, the economic success in China is really impressive. And we are now exporting slightly more than 200 billion euro toward China, and imports is about close to 400 billion. If you take a look at the picture here, it's the data on the right. That's the data for the US-China, and that's in US dollar. And the overall amount is similar. So if you add it together, 100 plus 450, and these two figures here, it's close to similar. But there's one big difference. And the difference is the gap between exports and imports. So here it's 100 to 450, and here it's about 200 to 400. And so the United States is much more importing than it's exporting. And there was one study which made a lot of, was really influential, and it was called the China shock. The China shock was a study being made in the United States, and it showed that in those regions where people were working and they got competition from the Chinese the companies, people lost their jobs and they couldn't find a proper replacement on average or statistical data. And that's because there was purely competition. So you import a lot. That's different in Europe. So people did the same study for Europe and they couldn't find such a China shock. And the reason is because Europe is also exporting to China. And so that's really a difference, also, I think also in the attitude of how we position ourselves with China. It's more of a give and take than if you see the data of the United States. The title is Partner and Competitor. And, when we deal in our lecture on trade theory, we say it's good, trade overall increases the pie. And that's still correct. But here you see on the right hand top, China has its new strategy, Made in China 2025. And the idea is that several of the areas where so far they are importing goods, they want to do it at home. And so, in particular, the German industry takes that as a sign of competition is getting stronger. We want to do it ourselves. And so companies are nervous that at some point they will block the exports, which we do toward China, and produce those goods themselves. One look on services, the first data was on goods, and typically when we talk about trade in goods, but we also trade services. Services are financial services, tourism is services, logistics are services, consulting, advice is services. And here you see two things on the slide. One is that with regard to services, we export more than we import. And that's actually the same with the United States and China. The United States export more than they import from China with regard to services. And second thing it's not, the figures are not as large, but as with goods, but also here they are increasing. And the second point I want to make is that if you look at the trade and services US-EU, then it's much larger than the trade and services EU-China or US-China. And so if you add it all together, services and goods, Europe is still much more connected, interlinked with the United States than it is towards China. So what is, from an economic point, I'm only talking about the economic point, what is, I would say, the problem with China, purely economic point of view? If you say, okay, we do trade with them and there's competition, Chinese firms, we buy cheap products and, we export to them. So where's the problem coming from? And the main problem from an economic point of view is that they have an economic model which has much more state interference into it. So the Chinese economic model is called socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics. It's not fully clear what that means, the Chinese characteristics and the socialist market economy. It's, in a way, it's a hybrid model. They have many market economy elements. So there's part of Chinese economy is very strong competition, but they have also very important part for the state economy. And so there is central economic planning. They have an active industrial policy, and they have their state-owned companies. And state-owned companies used to have less importance over time, but in recent years, I think they have become even more important. And for me, this data here at the bottom of the slide is, I think, quite indicative of the economic models they have. So if you have a look at the global Fortune 500, so these are the 500 top firms in the world, then out of these, 143 are Chinese. So China's number one worldwide in that respect. But out of these 143, 82 are state-owned. I'm not sure actually how many German firms there, but I think out of these top ones, one is state-owned, the Deutsche Bahn. And in France, I think it's 3 or 4. In the United States, it's 1 or 2. In China, it's 82. 82 of the largest companies out of these 143 are state-owned. So the state interferes into the economy. And that's a real problem because in the United States, as in Europe, we have a free market. We have a free market where firms compete, and there is the state. Actually, in Europe, the state is not allowed to interfere. We have state aid control. So France cannot just give money to, France Telecom, because that would violate European rules. We have as rules that the state should not interfere. It should be fair competition in the market. But here now we enter competition with Chinese firms, and they are subsidized, either they're state-owned companies or they are subsidized by the state. And that's a real problem. So my final slide for this introductory remark. So how is Europe reacting towards it? And one way of reacting is that they say, if you want to compete on our market, then you have to obey our rules. And our rule says no state subsidies. Actually, not all state subsidies are forbidden. So if you subsidize firms which are in region which are underdeveloped, or if you subsidize firms for research and development purposes, then you can apply to the European Commission, and she says, okay, that's a fine subsidy, or that subsidy is forbidden. And so and the current state is, France cannot subsidize, say, France Telecom, but the Chinese state could, because there's no rule. They would violate. State subsidy control is only for European states. And so what the European Commission is planning to do is to have control of state subsidies even for third parties. So foreign subsidies, here it says, it's leveling the playing field as regards to foreign subsidies. And we, as a Monopoly Commission, at the same time, we also wrote a report and we suggested to have a new instrument, which we called third country state aid instrument, because it's state aid control we want to have. And the proposals are quite similar. One difference is, what is a subsidy and how you define a subsidy exactly. And so there are some different minor differences, but the direction is clear. If foreign companies want to compete in the European internal markets, they have to obey the rules of the European internal market. And one important rule is no state interference. And on the right-hand side, that would be, so the left-hand side would cover competition inside Europe. What about competition inside China? And that's very hard because, inside China sets rules, and that's quite clear. So how can you influence those rules with agreements? And we are talking probably also today on, how we should position ourselves toward China and what's the way to go. But, thinking, say, 10 years ahead, thinking 20 years ahead, China will still be there. I guess we will still make a lot of trade with China. China is a large economy. It's a great economy, but we need rules. It should be rules-based. And so I think it's important to have rules and work on those rules. And I know there are a lot of arguments that, rules are not, some companies don't obey to those rules or the state doesn't obey, but still it's rule-based, our international multilateral relationships. And that was one element in this rule-based system. So in December, the European Union and China signed an investment agreement. So it's not a trade agreement, it's an agreement on investment. It's kind of a first step. And here you see Merkel and Macron, so German and French president, Ursula von der Leyen, the European president, and Michel, he is the president of the European Council, and Xi Jinping from China, and they were signing this agreement. That's just the first stage of the, getting the agreement to work. And now the parliament has to talk about, has to decide on it, and European governments. And there are good reasons why it will take a very long time for that agreement to go through. But still, that is the European response to kind of the competition with China. Inside Europe, obey the rules. In China, we are working on new rules so that we have fair competition. Okay, so much for the impulse. Looking forward for the discussion. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Friedlander. I'm going to take over the conversation from here and just give a little bit of a response to what Achim has just laid out for us. And I look at things a little bit more from the intersection between economics and foreign policy, given my own background in the national security community in the United States. And so I'll try to sort of draw a few links out there before we go into a broader conversation. And just to pick up first, I would say, what does it actually mean when we say strategic or systemic competitor? Right? When, as Achim has laid out, the US and the EU have enjoyed a very fruitful profit-based relationship with China that has largely served respective comparative advantages quite well, right? In my world, what that means increasingly, right, when we say systemic competitor, is that economics and regulatory issues and standard setting are taking on a foreign policy role, right? Or and that's sort of a constructive way of phrasing it, right? Some are saying, and I think this is less charitably, this is economic warfare or weaponization of interdependence. I don't like these terms very much, but I see where people are coming from, especially given some of the actions taken by the previous US administration, right? My longstanding concern when we say things like weaponization, right, is that this is a recognizable language for the traditional national security community. So we're saying the word weapon, right? So that's something that the kind of language and framework that those who are now worried about supersonic missiles or provocations in the South China Sea are used to dealing with. And my experience is that these people don't always understand economics very well, just by virtue of their own backgrounds, or the realities of what the roles that regulation plays in the EU relationship with China, the US relationship with China, and what the limitations of that would be. And then that goes both ways, right? It's easier for grand strategists, right, to speak in broad brush terms, But then when you go talk to some hedge funds or banks, which I do quite often, they say, well, don't blame us. That's somebody else's problem, right? And so finding the way to have a joint language to discuss how economics becomes a national security concern, right, is I think the core of the problem. And here I always like to point out to international financial markets. Okay. And to say, when national security professionals will often see things in a little bit more of an immediate gain or loss. And one party's territorial gain is another party's territorial loss. And I think that, when we talk about overall economic welfare in the international and global financial market that we live in today, that kind of point of analysis just doesn't apply, right? So when I hear colleagues talking about nuclear deterrence, I say, okay, well, what also is a deterrent is the fundamental integration of U.S. financial markets with Chinese financial markets, with serious limitations. Obviously, capital markets controls, market access controls. We can go into that later, but the problem is, I'm not sure also that investors, right, view themselves as part of this systemic competition, right, that national capitals are starting to develop and say, oh, by the way, you're a part of this, and you're at the front lines. Which is sort of where, and I'll go back to sort of maybe this sort of dovetails with what Achim was talking about state aid rules, is where we get to regulation and market access, right? And here, this is where I think the EU becomes much more powerful than people make it out to be, because Brussels excels in the kind of fine print that no one likes to read, right? Regulation is sometimes like combing through all of those instructions and side effects on the back of a new medicine package before you take the pill for the first time, right? Most people don't read it, and they don't understand that it could have significant impact, right? The tools sound appealing, but the execution is not, right? It can be sort of boring. It takes a lot of time. And this is specifically true, I think, on the EU side, in designing the initial regulation. On the U.S. side, it's after the initial decision has been made, right, in U.S. being one country, and then in the processes that we have to roll them out. So it all takes time, which of course leads many to be frustrated that it's not working fast enough. So here, I think, just to say, the EU has as much leverage as the United States over China, if not more, because of this sort of broader framework and a little more strategic patience, maybe in the subsidies policy, or even in the now stalled out investment agreement, right? It's not supposed to necessarily work overnight. The US has taken much more punitive versus what you would say preventative approach, right? Maybe that's because that's what the United States is good at. Think of how we've used sanctions over the past 10 years. Or maybe it's because we have less patience. Sanctions and tariffs are things you can do immediately, right, in an attempt to gain leverage. It's an immediate show of force, of resolve. But in the end, going back and setting up long-term regulatory standards may have better chances of succeeding over time. And that's where, as we go through, as the transatlantic trade and technology partnership is getting underway, and in consultations that I have with stakeholders, I say, like, this is where the U.S. learns from the EU. But when it comes down to sort of some of these tactical conversations, I think ultimately in the end, right, this is a question over what is industrial policy and what is protectionism and what counts as national security. So the phrase is, so what is national competitiveness and what is national security? Okay, I think the line gets really fine sometimes, especially when you deal with domestic politics. But, I couldn't help but notice this week, right, that NATO, okay, the military alliance, NATO, has just put together a joint fund for technological innovation, and this is clearly with China in mind. But ask yourselves this, and you don't necessarily have to have a clear thought here. Is that actually the role of a military alliance, right, or of state organizations at all? And where does the line stop, Where does technological innovation stop? And so these are the big questions we're asking ourselves right now and playing out in real time. Both the U.S. Congress and also in Brussels is happening as well. We're talking about supply chain security and certainly ramping up domestic production of chips. Right, we're seeing a lot of this recently. But think about this: what do we do for supply chain security, for secure telecommunications? This is the whole 5G debate that you've heard a lot about. Or to protect firms from hostile takeover. So this is investment security, Chinese firms buying, controlling shares of European ones or of critical infrastructure like the port of Piraeus, right? So where does that stop, and where do we start talking about protectionism? And that is sort of where traditional German or U.S. thinking, right, as we say, we're free markets, start to get nervous, right, and start to see, okay, how much are we going, compromising our principles here? So I look forward to engaging in future debate here and answering all of your questions. But I'm going to ping a question back to Achim for starters, and ask him then again, building off of that, and the next German government, which is, knock on wood, going to be in place very soon, what you think the approach is going to be specifically on industrial policy, on what some members of the outgoing coalition refer to as national champions with regards to China.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. That's actually, and there's also one question on that in the chat. That's actually, I think it's a big debate in Europe. Do we need more industrial policy? Because, the way I framed my slides, I was saying, we have free competition, and that's what we want in Europe. And that's what the European Commission is arguing. But that's not what the national governments want. And that's not all, yeah. And that's definitely not what the companies want. So the companies complained about China, the German Federal Industry Association, saying China is a systemic rival and we need more subsidies here. So one response toward China could be we have more subsidies in Europe. And I'm very happy that the European Commission was saying, no, we have state aid control and that's a good instrument. And let me give you one argument why I think it's also really good to go that way. In China, most of the dynamics in China is not done in the state-owned companies. The dynamics in China is in those sectors of the markets which are competitive. It's not in the state-owned companies. They really have problems. They have that overhang. They are not productive, or productivity increase is very low. And dynamics is the sector where you have competition. And so that's why we are pushing. We means academics, and also some governments are pushing to have these competitive, to have the competition going and not having unfair competition. But I think it's a very valuable point. And you are asking for the new government. It's a mixed bag. So in our new government, presumably, it's not yet fully decided, but we have the left and the Green Party, and they are in favor of more industrial policy. Some national champions, I think they would like the Deutsche Bahn or the Deutsche Telekom. Yeah, so they I think there's some sympathy towards national champions. Actually, we always think European, so we think about European champions. No one is talking about national champions. They always have to talk about European champions. But I think they like them. But we also have the liberals in the government, and the liberals they are more in favor of a competitive market. So I think that's the debate we have to watch. And for example, in Germany, we have control of if there's M&As, if Chinese companies are trying to buy a German company, then the German government investigates this case. And one is never sure whether that's, it's just for security. It's the reason is national security, so they can, or it's also for industrial policy reasons. So I think that's the debate to be watched. Let me ask you one question, because that's what puzzles me really about this debate. I see Europe, and I see that we don't have a clear strategy towards China, and we have this, industrial policy thing and security issues and so coming up. Looking over to the United States, as you mentioned, you said they have less patience. We could say they are more active. Yeah. So they act. Yeah. But what is not clear is, what is the goal? they act with what kind of goal? Yeah. So because I think we should have as a goal that we have a rule-based system. Yeah. And China is so strong and the Asian market is so large that you can't just exclude them from everything. Yeah. That's not a viable strategy. So what's the American strategy on China? So what's the goal?
I mean, I think that's the $100 question. I think that we don't actually know. No one really, I think we're just sort of circling around understanding the scope of the problem across all areas of operation, and then figuring out what to do next. I mean, so I'll say that when I served at the White House under the last administration, right, it was like we ripped off a Band-Aid to saying China's a ginormous problem and ran around trying to put all these Band-Aids and policies in place to try to address it, without really sort of thinking, okay, is this going to be a durable policy, and how long is this going to last? I mean, I think that was sort of the thinking behind the initial, trade agreement, which phase one of the trade agreement, which probably will expire unless something miraculous happens, will expire next month, is to try to sort of get to really sort of pressure China back to the negotiating table, right? So this is how America traditionally uses leverage. We use punitive tools to bring a country to the table to then sort of level set and find a new balance. This is something we do with and has been done multilaterally in other fora. Think about Iran and the JCPOA, for example. I think ultimately, if you talk to the Treasury Department or USTR, our trade authority, they're going to say some very similar things to the way you described the European debate. What worries me is that we've started to use China as the new boogeyman. So, as in the domestic economic reform. So, if you want to create a bipartisan agreement on domestic spending, for example, such as the infrastructure bill that is currently going back and forth, or stimulus, more broadly. Then it's going to be, instead of saying, well, these are our domestic economic problems, we've let them develop and stew for 30 years, we're going to blame China for all of it as a convenient political peg. And so that's when I think we lose the sight of the end game, right? I think that colleagues of mine at the Pentagon would say, no provocations, no advancements of the military kind that unseat a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. But deep down inside, I don't really think anyone knows what that looks like either.
Okay, but that's it's good to hear that. In Germany, there's a debate, and I guess it's a European debate. They are saying at some point you have to decide between the United States and China. Yeah. So and then I took chance and say, I don't know what the Americans are up for. So it's very clear. It's not clear what it needs to decide. But
I don't know what that means either. I don't think.
Right. So it's but also because there's also one question in the chat is I think the decision is very clear. Yeah. So we have nuclear weapons from the United States and not from China in Germany. Yeah. So it's we are part of NATO, and it's very clear, and that's why also the data is showing. We are much more interlinked with the United States, but it's not clear what the strategy is. And you see, Merkel, this investment agreement was really pushed by Merkel. It's kind of one of her final things she did, yeah. And she's really kind of the person who wants to, have the rules and have a mediating system. And she also believes that more trade is good also for the international relationship. And so that's why I think that's the direction which in all the debate we have in Europe, and everyone is nervous, but we are heading for. But maybe one look over to you in the United States. What do you expect from Europe? So if you are not fully clear in the United States what your strategy, what do you expect from Europe to do? So should we join these the more protectionist measures, or is it? I know what's your thought about the wish of the American government to the European institutions?
I think that sort of on the individual level, the U.S. has actually been relatively good at communicating expectations and sort of the use of what the tools of economic statecraft. And this is so please set up investment screening mechanisms. All right, now let's talk about what the problem is and try to use them sort of in parallel. Please set up more rigorous export control systems that go beyond sort of dual use goods and what's regulated by the Wassenaar agreements, for example. Please try to protect critical infrastructure. Things like that, I think, have been communicated quite well. What I think is less is harder is because, of course, the US and the EU are economic competitors at the same time, and so talking about when we say, okay, please ensure the long-term competitiveness of your industry is not something we'll understand it, right? But it's not going to be a talking point in the same regard. We're going to think about I think the European relationship with China much more in sort of, again, as I say, in national security terms, and keep pushing it. Unfortunately, I think in that terminology, which I think falls flat in a lot of European capitals, where we'd like to talk about competition and fair rules, which I think is harder of a harder sell in the United States, which is quite frankly pretty bad at competition policy.
Yeah. So actually, because there's also one question in the chat on that. So what German companies are doing, I know it for Germany, but I guess it's a European way, is that they regionalize in China. So one response to Corona and these aggressive policies by the Americans and not clear what the final strategy is going to be is that they regionalize their production into China. So if there is a cutoff at the border, then they can still produce in China because they are already in China. Yeah, is this worrisome? I don't think so, because you see that also in the United States, our automobile companies, they are all producing in the United States, and I think Volkswagen, they are producing in Mexico, and they had a bad time when Trump was putting the taxes on imports. But for those producing in the United States, they went, they were not part of this trade war issue, which was going on, and so we see more of this, regionalization. We see more diversification. So we see European firms not just being only dependent on China, or now in the case of semiconductors, to be dependent on Taiwan. Taiwan is a real worry for every company. If you're too dependent on Taiwan, no one knows exactly what's going to happen there, but everyone expects something to happen in the next 10 years. We had a survey across companies, so it's the next 10 years they are thinking something will happen, so they are they try to be less dependent on Taiwan, but they are they have to make decisions. Business people have to make decisions, and that's in a political uncertainty. And maybe if I can make one more argument, because there's also one question on that one here, I was asked by Bloomberg whether the Chinese are copying the German model. The Chinese have regulated away their leading tech companies, B2C companies, and say they want to invest more in automation and automobile companies and machines and so on. And there might be something to it, but my argument was that the German economic model is that you have predictability. So that you can, if you do investment, you still believe that in 10 years we have a similar economic policy. So, they don't take your investment away. And what we see at the moment in China is there's a lot of uncertainty also about the policy the Chinese government is going to take. And so at the moment, it's not the German model. Because the German model is really about, being about, you can protect, you can kind of calculate with what is going to happen. And at the moment, you can't do it. Yeah. But I must say, at the moment, it's really also hard to calculate to determine what the international relationship will be in the coming years. Yeah. So
I think that we're thinking about the same thing, and we're looking at about I'll go back and watch your Bloomberg clip, but I think that what we're sort of assessing over here on the tech company front is really this is an element of state control. Right. And specifically of monetary instruments or central bank digital currency debate, for example, is much more about the private firms now hold all the data that the government would like to hold, and sort of seeing that the market openness that created this economic growth is sort of actually going against what they define as the interests of the state, and so that's the sort of the self cannibalism comes from that place. But Razi, our host, he's back.
Yeah, thank you very much for this insightful and extremely helpful talks and discussions. We would love also to address some of the questions we have in the Q&A, and I just would love to read them out. I think there's one clarifying question, but the EU-China agreement is on hold, isn't it? And
yes, it is.
It is. Okay. Okay, I think.
The European Parliament has, it's typical with these agreements that they have a lot of demands, and here there are some demands which, on the Uyghurs, which are just too demanding, so it's on hold, and it will take some time to get over that stage.
All right, thank you very much. Then there is another question, which is, I think, at the intersection between economic growth and democracy. Given that you outlined, probably it's referred to your presentation, China as a hybrid model, should we be afraid of a more China models, especially in Asia, because democracy and free market are no longer necessary conditions for economic growth? Would love to answer.
It looks like, if that's the case, but that's why I mentioned the dynamics was in the free market part of China, not in the state-owned parts. And the China model so far was a catch-up economy. So they are very professional, very good. But you see still the production per head in China is a quarter of OECD average. Yeah, so it's a quarter of OECD average. So there's still a long way to go. And what we will see, and that's the big question, is can they sustain this dynamic being at the edge, being at the frontier of research? And I think there are good reasons to believe that they won't sustain that dynamics. Yeah, so I'm not too much worried that the China model will be copied around Asia. And I actually don't see states being very keen on copying the China model. I'm not sure, Julia, you have a different opinion on that one?
I'm not entirely sure. I think that some countries are seeing certainly seeing state control as something, and state directed investment as efficient. Efficient allocation of capital, where our international markets are a little bit messy, and certainly in the pandemic, with all of the fiscal stimulus that the United States put into the market, it couldn't cycle into the real economy. It floated around and made Amazon a lot richer, but did not sort of get the gears of manufacturing going. So I think there's some sort of something going there about inefficiencies of financial markets, and that was even sort of acknowledged by our national economic counselor in a speech she gave at the Atlantic Council, but sort of just how do we rethink some of the sort of more brutish aspects of a free market economy, not a fundamental questioning, I think, in the way that I think the participant asked.
All right, thank you. Maybe next question, which also relates to the bargain power, which you referred to as important for the mutual agreement between the EU and China. The question is, in the light of China's recent massive state interventions into its economy, is there really still a chance for mutual rule-based trade relations between China and the West in the future? Doesn't China's current policy point towards separating the markets, supplying China with homemade goods and driving foreign competitors out of the market?
So China is definitely pursuing a strategy to move production back to China. But also here, China is, as I said, a quarter of OECD average. If they increase with that growth rate, say 5 to 6%, in about 20 years, they will have, 15 years, they will have half of OECD average, but that means they are twice as large. So the economy is growing incredibly. And then it's a natural response that you produce more at home. So, the United States is exporting much less than Germany is, in a relative proportion, and even much less than say the Netherlands are. The smaller you are, the more you are exporting and importing. So that's kind of a national tendency. Is there a chance for rule-based trade relationship? I think it's our only chance. And there's one question later on environmental policy. So how in the world shall we believe that we solve the climate policy issue without getting China, being part of the climate club or however you want to be? And that has to be rules-based. So I think that's the way to go. And let me say, from the companies I'm talking to, for example, protection, patent law, and protection of ideas. I think they tell me that it's not like in Europe, but it has increased the system. Yeah, also because China also has patents to be lost. Yeah, and so there are rules which exist, and as long as they don't interfere with the states, they stick to the rules. Yeah, so that's kind of what companies tell me. So it's possible to have a more rule-based system. I think that's the way to go. Yeah.
I would agree with that. I think that's just speaks to trying to develop a strong and consistent regulatory framework, particularly transatlantically, right? So the transatlantic economy together is a global standard setter. Let's just put it that way.
All right, thank you. Maybe then last question, which also relates to the transatlantic relationship. Given the strong trading exposure between China and the EU that we have seen in your slides, and given that it will also very likely continue to increase, what economic and political implications would this imply for the EU and the US relations in the long run? I think this is a question which probably Julia can start with.
I think that there's a fundamental balancing act, and I'll just say this quite frankly, that we're going through in the United States right now about a sort of rebalancing of global power, and understanding where a new America might fit into that. Certainly, as still the largest economy, still by far the largest military power, but how we are going to how we're really going to balance that in the long run. And I think that then that's where the sort of the economic relationships come in too, that will have to be based much more on a multilateral system where the US wasn't always the biggest elephant in the room, right? And this goes back to sort of, I think, what we sometimes, we talk about reform of the IMF or reform of the World Bank, is that these are going to be much more sort of colorful institutions than they have been in the past, and that speaks to this, the potential real strength of and that the strength of the European Union is in the direct national security interest of the United States because of that potential long-term rebalancing. But again, I'm talking about this not tomorrow or the next day, but over the next 50 years or so.
Yeah. Merkel said in her famous speech, I think 2017, that the times are partly gone where you can just trust on being protected by someone else, and that she meant the United States. Yeah, so I think there is this debate in Europe that how, do we need more independence? How much can we trust that the United States is, supporting us, and we have the same, that we still go in the same direction. But when it gets tough, I think they stick to the United States, and we see all these ways like the NATO effort to reassure this relationship, and also Merkel was not assuming that that there's a way going away from the United States, but more that we have to be more, do our part of the deal. For example, invest more in military. Our military expenditure has to increase, and we have to solve our European problems ourselves. We can't also not expect the United States to solve them. Yeah, so if there are problems in our neighborhood, so I guess that's what we will see. But both the data, and also our history speaks to that. Yeah, and I'm very much positive about the EU and US relationship also in the long run. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, given our time, we would just love to hear the closing remarks from your side, and we would also love to know what should or shouldn't be done from your perspective or from your expertise in terms of the future EU strategy on China. Maybe Julia, you want to start, and then Achim could add some words on. Thank you.
I mean, I'm just curious to see about how the next couple of years develop, right? And how these IP protections, subsidy instruments, implementation of export controls, investment security. Again, these things are brand new, and see how they actually do play out. I'm actually quite optimistic in this regard, and I would also say I might have been one of two people in Washington who did not cry and scream when the CAI was announced, because I recognized in it elements of what the United States has been trying to do, and we certainly can't fault our closest partners for trying to set a standard to hold. And I hate using this phrase, but hold China to account, right? You can't, if you want to tell a competitor or rival or whatever, you violated the rules. The rules need to be there in the first place.
Thank you.
We had at my research institute members of the Chinese embassy visiting us, and we spent most of the time debating climate policy. And when I go to conferences to China, it's all about climate policy. And why is that? And I think it's kind of an effort. I'm not sure how ordered this effort is, but it's because that's our common ground, and we are working jointly, that's what the world has to do jointly on the climate policy. So I think there's so many things where we have to be in a cooperative mood and not in a competition mood. Yeah, and also, actually, I think international trade should be done in a cooperative mood. International trade is a win-win. It's not like, Julia, you mentioned in security issues is one wins, the other lose. Yeah, international trade is win-win. Yeah, and in climate policy, we can win together, or we can lose together. Yeah, but it's also kind of win-win situation. Yeah, where we can, and we should find more of these win-wins and try to work in that direction. But I agree with you, Julia. The next 5 to 10 years, or let's say the next 5 years, we also have to watch, how that works out and where all these stress lines will appear. Yeah, it's not an easy time at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed for your time and these very insightful discussions. I think we have learned a lot, and we will see what to follow. And again, thank you very much from the entire GSC team, and we're going to conclude this session. Thank you.